Soviet life. How do you think his passing will be seen there?
Well, I think, Aaron, you'd have to say, number one, he was really the symbol of the Cold War. The defining rhetoric of the Cold War. Even here in Russia, people know the phrases, the evil empire, Star Wars, and you have to go back to his famous speech at the Berlin Wall where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So these things are very tied with the concept that people here have of their country. Now, if you were to look at it, on the one hand, the people who wanted the Soviet Union to end, who did indeed think that it was an evil empire, they would remember Ronald Reagan very fondly for having played a major, major role in the end of the Soviet Union. Others who rue the end of the Soviet Union might not be as kind. And then also, Aaron, you have to say that debate over the question of whether President Reagan's increase in the military budget and that arms race really did lead to the end of the Soviet Union. There are new theories coming out on that right now.
I think it is always a little dangerous and probably simplistic to say any one thing or any one person was responsible for, in this case, the end of the Cold War. It was a complicated set of facts. I just wonder if, by and large, not people on the extremes, but people in the middle in Russia don't want to take some credit on their own for the change, don't want to acknowledge the role of Gorbachev in what he did, and later even Yeltsin, when it looked like things might really go south.
Right. There are the people who would argue that, let's say human rights people who would argue that they pushed and pushed and pushed, and that had an effect. There's also the theory, which is quite interesting, about oil prices. You know, Russia is a huge, always has been, a very, very big oil producer. And at that point, oil prices were crashing, and that had an effect. But overall, people here, if you look at it economically, would have to say that the Soviet Union's economy was so impractical and could never sustain itself, and that ultimately it just collapsed of its own weight. But I think you'd have to say that many people here would agree that that arms race and the fight between the United States and the Soviet Union at that point, outspending the Soviet Union, was one of the key elements in pushing it over the edge.
Robin, in many ways, and not unlike George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan scared the Europeans to death.
Well, he certainly did initially, Aaron. There was this image of him as a cowboy. I think the Europeans found it hard initially to take seriously somebody who'd spent part of his career as a Hollywood actor. That's not a common background for European politicians. They saw him initially perhaps as something of a warmonger. They were disturbed by some of the strength of his Cold War rhetoric. But I think partly due to the chemistry that he developed with Margaret Thatcher, they gradually came to take him as a much more sophisticated politician. She, after all, was the one who persuaded him that they could both do business with Mikhail Gorbachev, as she put it. And indeed, he began to do business with Mikhail Gorbachev to such an extent that she actually became alarmed when the two of them met in Reykjavik, and she felt that President Reagan was, as it were, handing over the whole of the Western arms arsenal. And she had to dash off to Washington soon after that and reprimand Ronald Reagan for overdoing it, as she saw it. And I think Europe gradually adjusted to him over a period, and European politicians were not impervious to the sheer charm of Ronald Reagan. He was, many of them found, a nice guy to meet.
Well, yes, so sort of interpersonal relationships, then, now, in between presidents who are successful have to have them, whether it's in domestic policy or international affairs. Will it be an enormous story in London, or will it just be front page coming up and pretty much move on?
It will be a big story for at least a day, I think, Aaron, partly because, again, of that the memories that people have of the personal chemistry with Margaret Thatcher. We had Thatcherism, you had Reaganomics, and the two of them were two politicians who saw the world in black and white, not in the intervening shades of grey. When she first met him as governor of California in 1975, I think it was, she said she felt instinctively then that here was somebody who felt and thought as she did. And they built on this together, and they shared all these instincts about less government, about lower taxes, about effective military spending, and so on. And this did build into probably one of the most effective and enduring political alliances of world leaders through the 1980s. But it was personal as well. And Margaret Thatcher, when we saw her getting a little bit down back at home, she'd dash across to the United States to see President Reagan and get a kind of recharging of her ideological batteries.
Robin, it's good to see you. Jill, thank you. In Russia, Jill Doherty over there, Robin Oakley in London. Appreciate your work tonight. Thank you very much. We'll take a break here. We have much more ahead, a 2-hour special edition of Newsnight on a Saturday night as we honor former President Ronald Reagan, who died today in Southern California.
World Sport, the nation's passion, in association with HSBC, the world's local bank.
Some people say that boxing champions are born. That's not so. Champions are formed. In Cuba, the system allows kids to start boxing from an early age. We bring them into the gyms and teach them the proper boxing techniques with professional coaches. These kids, they all want to be like Stevenson, like Felix Savon. These boxing legends are an inspiration to them. In this country, sport is the right of every citizen, and the fact that we have a lot of successful boxers is very important. We always dedicate our victories to our people. We are proud to belong to the Cuban nation.
In association with HSBC, the world's local bank.
Ronald Reagan was for years a card-carrying Democrat. After switching parties, he went on to give the country a new conservative view of itself. He enjoyed extraordinary popularity among Republicans and a fair number of Democrats who became Reagan Republicans. Many still are. CNN's Ted Rollins is in Santa Monica, California, where earlier today, hundreds of people gathered outside the funeral home where Mr. Reagan's body was taken. Ted, good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron, and there are still dozens of people outside of this funeral home milling around, watching really nothing, just looking at the funeral home. There's a small memorial that has started here with flags and flowers, and it's difficult to see, but in the back of it, and very poignantly, is a cowboy hat that was placed here early this afternoon. People have been coming here to pay their respects. You mentioned the party affiliations. We've been talking to people who say they are both Republican and Democrat. All of them felt the need to come out here and pay their respects on this day, this history-making day. According to the Reagan aides, and there are a number of them still here at the funeral home. They've been here throughout the day. They say they'll make an announcement tomorrow at noon here in Santa Monica as to the particular schedule of events. Of course, they have been pretty much laid out in terms of what will happen to the remains. Of course, first to Simi Valley for a day and then on to Washington, D.C., where the funeral will take place, and the former president's remains will lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. But that specific schedule should be laid out tomorrow morning and announced at noon here in Santa Monica. Of course, the family will have the final say as to when that clock, if you will, starts ticking, and all of these things happen. Until the through the weekend, it is expected that the president's remains will remain here and be prepared in Santa Monica. Tonight, though, a lot of people just coming out, people that happen to live in this neighborhood, to pay their respects to the former president.
Just very, very quickly, okay? When people come by, are they in tears, or because in some respects, obviously a man passed, that's sad, or are they just there to pay respects?
I think it's they're here to pay respects, and you know the people are thinking back, taking away the last 10 years when, of course, he publicly fought Alzheimer's. People are remembering Ronald Reagan. Everybody formulates a relationship, if you will, with their president, and depending on the age of the individual, people are reflecting and they're talking about it amongst themselves and to members of the media.
Ted, thanks a lot. Ted Rowlands in Santa Monica tonight, getting a little more detail on the sequence of events, and the key to me in all of this is sometime tomorrow afternoon about 3 o'clock Eastern time, if not before, if it leaks out, we'll have a pretty fair idea of when the official funeral series of events will begin, first in California, then in Washington, and ultimately back in California where Mr. Reagan will be buried. Frank Donatelli has been good enough to stay up late with us. He's in Washington. He worked for both Ronald Reagan campaigns, the Reagan White House, and from 87 through 89. He's now the chairman of the Reagan Ranch Board of Directors. So he goes way back with the former president. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
At the risk of seeming indelicate, I hope this isn't, is a day like this in some way a day of mixed feelings? Is there some sense of relief for his family that this very difficult period has finally ended?
Yes, absolutely. There isn't any question about that. There's tremendous sadness on the one hand because we feel like we've all lost a great leader. On the other hand, the last several years could not have been easy for his family. So this is a blessing, I think, for the president and for his family.
I'm not sure there's, honestly, Frank, there's a question in this, but let me just throw out an idea and see what you have to say. One of the things that I will always admire about the Reagans, and in particular Nancy Reagan, is the public way that she addressed this terrible illness, an illness that many families didn't want to talk about, were ashamed that it existed in their family, and how she changed our consciousness about it, and through him as well.
Well, I think that's a very good observation. I think one of the reasons that President Reagan decided to go public with his illness was that he wanted to tell people and families that were in this same circumstance that by being strong and by being courageous, you can get through it. And if that's the message that he meant to convey 10 years ago when he first told us about this, I think he was very, very successful.
If there was one thing about him, one moment with him to share with viewers tonight, what would it be?
Oh my, there will be so many things. Well, I'll just pick something, I guess, at the end of his administration. When in the last year of his presidency, I would fly with him from the White House on Marine One to Andrews Air Force Base on the helicopter, and I would notice that inevitably he would be looking down at some of the homes that we would fly over in Prince George's County, Maryland. And I said to him once, I said, Mr. President, what do you see down there? And he said, look at that, look at that, look at those homes. They're beautiful homes and they're owned by working people. I've got to show Gorbachev how much freedom works in America and how American working men and women can make a better life for themselves. There's no reason why they can't do that in his country also. And I'm told that the next several months after that, when Gorbachev did come to the United States, he took him on that same helicopter ride.
That is a great story. It's nice to talk to you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Very, very much. We appreciate it. George Shultz worked for Ronald Reagan during the presidency. I remember, I think, and in fact, I think I now even remember the event. I think George W. Bush was speaking at the Reagan Library, and I believe Mr. Shultz was there, and Mr. Shultz is on the phone with us now. Good evening to you, sir. Your thoughts tonight? Well, it was a pretty good wind-up, but apparently not a very good pitch. Are we going to get it back or not? Okay, we're not. Help me where you want to go then, and we'll... Okay, let's take a break. We'll sort out the phone line issues and all the rest, and we'll be right back. This is a special edition of Newsnight. nation's capital on this Saturday night in June, flags flying at half-staff. It's been a gray day in Washington as the nation mourns its 40th president, the passing of Ronald Wilson Reagan. President Reagan died in his California home about 1 o'clock in the afternoon Pacific Coast time. For the last 10 years, as of course you know, he has battled Alzheimer's disease. In the end, it was infection, as is often the case, that claimed his life. His body will come to Washington sometime this week, where the nation will officially mourn his passing, and then the former president will go back home to California, his adopted home in California, where he will be laid to rest. Ronald Reagan died today. He was 93. Robert Dallek is with us tonight. He is a noted historian of presidents, and we're always pleased to talk to him. There were, well, let me ask it as a question rather than an assertion. It has always seemed to me that there were two Reagan presidencies, the first term different from the second. Does it seem that way to you?
Yeah, I think, Aaron, the first term was a case of him learning the ropes, so to speak, but it was very much focused on the domestic side and the tax cuts and dealing with the economy. And the second term, of course, was much more a foreign policy presidency when he gave up on the rhetoric about the evil empire and saw an opportunity to deal with Gorbachev and move the Soviet Union toward the collapse of communism. And it was a very different second presidency from the first.
And then in the end of the second term, some of the shine had gone off, hadn't it?
Yes, without question, because the Iran-Contra affair sort of blighted his presidency at the end, and it left a certain question mark about his legacy. But nevertheless, he did end on a very high note in terms of his personal popularity. But, you know, historians are going to wrestle with these issues 15, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And he will be certainly remembered as a very significant president. And I think most particularly the fact that he came to the White House in 1981, the country was in a pretty sour mood about the presidency. You had Nixon's imperial presidency, you had the failure in Vietnam, Watergate, Ford and Carter had not done terribly well. And so Reagan restored a sense of hope, a sense of kind of uplift about the presidency. You know, it's ironic because he preached the idea that government was not the solution, government was the problem, and yet when he left the White House, he had kind of rekindled kind of affection for the presidency. And so it was, I think, a pretty nice irony.
No, I don't think he meant that kind of government. I don't think that's what he was thinking about. I think he was thinking about all those programs. Was he adaptable?
Well, he was adaptable. He was very adaptable. You know, as governor of California, he proved himself adaptable because, for example, he said his feet were on concrete on the issue of withholding tax, and then he signed a withholding tax law into law. But I think in his presidency on communism, on dealing with the Soviet Union, there you saw great adaptability on his part, because it was like two different administrations, the one that started out with the evil empire discussion, and then the second administration, which was really four summit conferences and almost a friendship that developed between him and Gorbachev.
Who had his ear? Whose advice did he most value?
Well, you know, I think in a way he was, in that sense, his own man. He had a strong sense of purpose. He had strong views about communism, about the economy, about government, and he really stuck to his ideas in that sense. So you see, the broad ideas he held to, but to implement them, he was much more practical, much more pragmatic.
Let me ask you one or two other things. It has always seemed to me that there was, as genial as he was, and in some ways as out there as he could be, he always held something back in his hip pocket about himself. He was difficult for biographers and historians in many respects, it seems to me, to capture. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I think this will be one of the puzzles for biographers in the future. You know, Edmund Morris struggled, I think, to come to terms with what the man as a personality, as an individual was about, because on the one hand, he was very genial, someone who was so likable and, of course, described as the great communicator, but he was a very private person and, as you say, was sort of held back from a kind of openness with people. And I don't know that a lot of his advisors felt as if they had a very close personal relationship with him.
That's interesting. Bob, it's very nice to see you. We appreciate staying up late with us on a Saturday night. Thank you, Bob Dallek, the noted historian and presidential biographer whose works are quite wonderful to read. We have much more ahead on this special edition of Newsnight. Bill Schneider joins us to talk about the Reagan impact on politics, especially American conservative politics. But there's much more, too, to note on a day when America loses one of its former presidents. Break first. This is Newsnight.
This is CNN.
The average computer has 110 keys. We say you only need 3.
Morning. Focus in. Reconnect with the world. Prepare for your day with CNN Today. Be prepared for the challenges. Be prepared for the possibilities. Overnight, the world changed. This morning, we'll tell you what happened and how it's important to you. Join Stan Grant and Christy Lou Stout to prepare for your day. CNN Today, only on CNN.
This is CNN.
What Ronald Reagan meant to the country is something for historians to talk about, and historians will talk about it. What he meant to his party, the Republican Party, and to the conservative movement is something for CNN's Bill Schneider to talk about.
The thing to remember about Ronald Reagan is this. He wasn't just a legend to the country, he was also a hero to a political movement.
Reagan is really the icon of the conservative movement. Without him, I think the conservatives would feel they've sort of lost their leader. They've lost their heroic figure.
Reagan rallied conservatives.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In 1988, he helped rally conservatives for George W. Bush's father.
George, just one personal request. Go out there and win one for the Gipper.
15 years later, Reagan still rallied conservatives. Last fall, CBS scheduled a miniseries, The Reagans, that included unflattering portrayals of the former president and first lady. Michael Paranzino started a website, boycottcbs.com.
We're taking our eyeballs elsewhere, and we're taking our wallets and our pocketbooks elsewhere.
CBS moved the miniseries to a cable network after conservatives rallied to defend their ailing hero. When George W. Bush needed to rally conservatives behind his campaign, there was no more potent symbol than Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan's leadership revived America's economy, renewed America's strength, and lifted America's confidence. And that spirit of optimism and faith in fundamental American values is the spirit we will carry to victory in November of 2004.
Reagan's death will be marked by elaborate memorials and occasions for the nation to mourn.
Ronnie's long journey has finally taken him to a distant place where I can no longer reach him.
It will put the presidential campaign on hold for some time. Conservatives may feel a call to arms to win one more for the Gipper. But these things can backfire. In 2002, Democratic Senator Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash in Minnesota 11 days before Election Day. Wellstone was a hero to the left. Many voters were put off when Wellstone's supporters turned his memorial service into what looked like a political rally.
We are begging you to help us win this Senate election for Paul Wellstone.
In the end, the seat was lost to the Republicans. Reagan's legacy belongs to the entire country. It could be a serious political mistake if conservatives try to appropriate it for political purposes. Aaron?
It's just a small thing, but it's actually quite interesting to note how powerful he is within the Republican Party and the conservative movement, to the point where you now fly into Reagan National Airport in Washington, and there was, I think even Mrs. Reagan found it quite unseemly, this attempt to replace FDR on the quarter, I guess it would be. But he owned their hearts.
He certainly did. I mean, to conservatives, 1980 is the year one. Nothing of importance happened before 1980, before Ronald Reagan. And the whole conservative movement, and even those Republicans who aren't part of it, all of them came from Ronald Reagan. Rudy Giuliani, Colin Powell, John McCain. They were all, in some way or another, Reaganites. They all came from under Reagan's umbrella. So the whole Republican Party traces its lineage, its legitimacy, to this one man.
Bill, thank you. Good to have you with us on a Saturday night as well, an important one. Bill Schneider with us from Washington tonight. We note the passing today of Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 40th President of the United States. We'll take a break, and CNN special coverage, and this special edition of Newsnight continues.
Thai Airways International is proud to be associated with Design 360. Thai, smooth as silk.
Che Guevara is an Argentinian doctor who becomes radicalized by his experience of traveling around Latin America in the 1950s. Hears about revolutionary activities of Fidel Castro, becomes a leading politician within Cuba after the revolution, and later goes on military adventures to try and start revolutions in Africa and finally in Bolivia, and is killed in the process of doing it. As a result, he's transformed into a revolutionary hero, and later, thanks to the famous photograph taken by Alberto Corda, into an icon which is recognizable around the world.
It's a very potent image. If you look at certain personality brand icons, there are only a very few who have stood the test of time.
Now non-stop from Bangkok to Milan, Italy's cool capital of design. Thai, smooth as silk. Now non-stop from Bangkok to Milan, Italy's cool capital of design. Thai, smooth as silk.
Since 1950, the World Meteorological Organization has been reporting and researching your weather and climate. It's a global system that works. Every country contributes every day of every year. The WMO, the world's weatherman since 1950.
Well, we're back late on a Saturday night to mark the passing of the 40th President of the United States. Ronald Wilson Reagan died this afternoon at his home in the Bel Air neighborhood of Los Angeles. Mr. Reagan was 93. He had been ill for some days or weeks. We don't know all the details of this, though we do know in recent days, let's leave it at that, his health, his physical health took a bad turn. He had been suffering from Alzheimer's for more than a decade. In many ways, Mr. Reagan lived several lives. There was this life, the life in Washington where flags fly tonight at half-staff, where the nation will publicly mourn the president over the course of the next week until his body is flown eventually back to California. He was a deeply private man in many respects, and as we talked about in the last hour, in some respects we didn't know him all that well. Over the next hour, we'll talk about what we do know and understand, the public side, what was and what's to come with the remembrances over the next several days. Suzanne Malveaux is at the White House tonight, and it is late. Suzanne, good evening to you. Are you able to get much detail yet?
Well, in terms of the schedule, we don't have the details of that, but we do know how the day unfolded. The flag flies at half-staff here, of course, at the White House, as they do at all federal installations. That is by order of the president. We know that the president's aides found out early in the day. They got a heads up that Reagan's health had taken a turn for the worse. The president was notified of Mr. Reagan's death in Paris about 4:10 Eastern Standard Time, shortly after 10 o'clock Paris time in the evening. President Bush had met with French President Jacques Chirac earlier in the day. He is there, of course, in France for the 60th anniversary of the D-Day remembrances in Normandy. And we understand it happened this way. It was Reagan's former Chief of Staff, Fred Ryan, who had called the White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card. Card immediately went to Mr. Bush to wake him of the news. We are told that the president's first words upon hearing of the news, he said, "It's a sad day for America." Mr. Bush called former First Lady Nancy Reagan shortly after midnight Paris time to offer the country's prayers and condolences. Shortly afterwards, from the hallway of the residence of the U.S. Embassy in Paris, he delivered these remarks.
Ronald Reagan won America's respect with his greatness and won its love with his goodness. He had the confidence that comes with conviction, the strength that comes with character, the grace that comes with humility, and the humor that comes with wisdom. He leaves behind a nation he restored and a world he helped save.
Now, Aaron, we are just moments away. The president is actually going to be waking up. He's going to be participating on Sunday in the events in Normandy, France, the 60th anniversary of D-Day. And that is where, of course, he is going to be meeting with other world leaders. We expect that he will make additional remarks in honor of President Ronald Reagan. Of course, he will also come back here. He will be traveling to Sea Island, Georgia, to host the G8 summit, again, with many leaders from around the world gathering at that time. There is still uncertainty in terms of when the schedule, they are waiting for that schedule from the Reagan family to determine just when the memorial service is going to be, but of course the president participating in that as well.
The G8 summit is scheduled to begin what day?
On Tuesday.
Okay. And that includes many of the people who would come to the country for a state funeral in any case. So without knowing this for certain, I think we could assume that through the course of midweek and beyond, the official events in Washington will probably play out.
Well, that's certainly right, Aaron. That's the sense that we're getting here as well, is that while all of those world leaders are here, in all likelihood, you are going to see those commemorations, those memorials begin.
Suzanne, thank you very much. Suzanne Malveaux. Ronald Reagan was the oldest man ever elected president of the United States for many years. He was the oldest living former president. The last chapter of his life was not an easy one, not for him and certainly not for his family. But what came before was quite remarkable. Here's CNN's Candy Crowley.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The guy could deliver a line, an actor by trade, a communicator by nature.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Born in Illinois, February 6, 1911, Ronald Reagan started out in radio in Iowa, made it to Hollywood, married 2 leading ladies, became a father of 4, and then took on a new role, politician. He was elected governor of California, ran for president, and stole a line from the movies.
I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
He won at age 69, the oldest man ever elected to the White House.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Reagan nearly died in an assassination attempt, but a quick recovery cemented his image as a tough guy on a mission. There were critics of huge deficits and painful spending cuts, and there were controversies. Iran-Contra, an arms sale deal with Iran to fund so-called freedom fighters in Nicaragua.
As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities.
He had a deceptively simple agenda.
Our government is too big and it spends too much.
Lower taxes, smaller government, a stronger military.
The American uniform is once again worn with pride.
Above all, an end to communism.
For the sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny.
Never one for inside the Beltway, he loved his place in the mountains above Santa Barbara, Rancho del Cielo, and entertained royalty there, and they returned the favor on their turf.
Before you.
His eyesight was too poor to serve in combat, but his was the greatest generation, and he remembered them often, most memorably at Normandy on the cliffs of Pontefract.
Well, what impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? We look at you and somehow we know the answer. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love.
He served for 8 years of history and then returned home to California. Bidding his party farewell 4 years later, the great communicator wrote his own epitaph.
And whatever else history may say about me when I'm gone, I hope it will record that I appealed to your best hopes, not your worst fears, to your confidence rather than your doubts.
And at least in the first draft of his legacy, he is being remembered that way. Senator John Kerry, the presumptive Democratic nominee, said Ronald Reagan's love of country was infectious, even when he was breaking Democrats' hearts. He did so with a smile. And on a live broadcast this morning, Garrison Keillor said that Reagan for years befuddled, quote, us old liberals, mainly with his great shining charm, which never, ever failed him. Aaron?
Candy, thank you. Candy Crowley in Washington. I just have this feeling that Mr. Reagan probably was appalled by the personal nature of politics these days. How nasty it often is, too often is in our view. That was not his way, not his style. He was of another time and another school for which the country, whether you agreed with him or not, was better off. He was, perhaps this is why, a Midwestern boy. He came from humble roots who grew up to be president, a storybook tale. He was born in a second-floor apartment. His father sold shoes. Those who knew young Ronald Reagan would say later that the boy remembered never left the man. More on that from CNN's Jonathan Freed.
As president, Ronald Reagan would be dubbed the Great Communicator for his ability to explain complex issues in simple terms.
And it took 300 people in my Office of Management and Budget just to read the bill so the government wouldn't shut down.
But from the time of his youth here in Illinois, they simply dubbed him Dutch. He was born in 1911 to parents Jack and Nell in the town of Tampico. The Reagans settled in Dixon when Dutch was 9 years old.
We were a family that could only be described as poor in a financial way or material way. And yet, we had a very happy life, the four of us.
Ronald Reagan spent hours at the Dixon Library and at the First Christian Church. He played football, performed in school plays, and yes, he was president of the Student Council. Some of the strongest hometown memories, though, flow from the river.
I can still see the dock out here, with Dutch walking up and down the dock, with his swimming suit on that said lifeguard, with a whistle around his neck.
Stories that made him smile decades later.
One man dove in and lost his false teeth, and he wanted them back very badly. And he asked Dutch if he would please dive in and find them. And after several dives, he found them.
In 1928, Ronald Reagan headed to Eureka College, just 60 miles south of Dixon. He played on the Golden Tornado football team and was captain and then coach of the swim team. He kept up the acting and was president of the Student Senate. He lived on the 3rd floor of the Teak Fraternity House and made money washing dishes with Elmer Fisher, who, like many of the president's contemporaries, has also passed away.
I know he's a good dishwasher because I worked with him. He did a good job.
The Ronald Reagan exhibit at Eureka showcases his degree in economics and sociology, an old college essay, his yearbook, and even a certificate from the Red Cross that he received for saving a child from drowning while he was governor of California.
Welcome home, Dutch.
In 1990, Mr. Reagan returned to Dixon for the last time, drawn again to the river.
You really pull 77 people out of here?
Yep. It's supposed to be the log. I used to cut a notch in a log for every one of them.
And he toured the restored home where he grew up.
It's pretty much like it always did.
The friends of his younger years consider it remarkable that the man who would be president never stopped being the regular guy they knew and loved.
He was just one of us. That's another reason why it was a bigger surprise to us probably than the people that didn't know him, to see how well he succeeded.
And if a measure of a person's worth on earth is how they think of you after you're gone, some of those who knew Ronald Reagan take his measure by the way his personality, they say, raised the spirits of a nation. Aaron, people say that Ronald Reagan had a way, a grandfatherly way, of calling the nation to his knee, patting it reassuringly on the head, and telling it that everything was going to be all right. Well, when the future president was little more than knee-high, he moved into the home behind me. Now, we've been talking to the good people of Dixon, Illinois, and many of them are saying that they were in many ways mentally prepared for what was going to happen today. The man was 93 years old. It's been known for a while that he hasn't been well. But more than a few have told us that even though they knew that this was coming, that they knew that this day was probably not that far off, it was still like being confronted by a parent's death. And they say that no matter how much you can try to prepare for that in advance, when you're actually facing it, it's still very difficult to take. Aaron?
Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan Freed, Dixon, Illinois. Tonight, Robert Novak needs no introduction to our viewers, certainly, and he joins us, I assume, from Washington. There you are. I asked Bob Dallek this question earlier. Who were the people that politically influenced him? Who did he listen to? Who had his ear?
I don't believe that he was greatly influenced by anybody, except I think Nancy Reagan influenced him on smaller things rather than larger things. One of the misconceptions about Reagan is that he was a kind of a slow-witted fellow. He was an intellectual. He read the economic texts of Bastiat, of Steele and Cobden in Britain. He was a great reader, and I think he was influenced in no small part by the past, and particularly on economics, a desire to return to the past. I don't believe there was anybody who controlled him or had his ear. I don't think there was a Colonel House as there was with Woodrow Wilson, or even some of the very close aides of Richard Nixon and H.R. Haldeman. I think he was a very, in many ways, a solitary figure who learned much of what he ventured into in politics through very extensive reading, which goes against the conventional wisdom.
It certainly does. You mentioned Mrs. Reagan and her influence on matters small, and some of them obviously had to do with image and other things, but she was an enormously important barometer for him about how things were going.
I think so. I think ideologically, I always had the idea that Nancy Reagan was a little bit more liberal than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a very, very conservative fellow. Naturally, through this long, dark Alzheimer's, there's been a softening of the image, and when anybody dies, nobody wants to be ideological, but a lot of people who didn't care for him much in life are saying that he was conscientious, he was a compassionate conservative, or even I even heard the word liberal mentioned, but he was quite conservative. I thought he was more conservative than Nancy was.
Think he's more conservative than George W. Bush is?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. I think I think he was, I don't think he did all the conservative things he wanted to do, such as the gold standard, and I think he would have wanted to do that. I don't think he cut down government to the size that he wanted to, because he was a practical man. He did what he could, and he did much more than any president in my lifetime did. But I think he's really intuitively and instinctively quite more conservative than either of the Bushes, including the present Bush, who was more conservative than his father was.
Was his election in 1980, and maybe even in some respects the failed campaign of '76, the knife in the heart of the moderate wing of the Republican Party?
I think it was part of a massive realignment, Aaron, that was arrested in part by Watergate and the disgrace of Richard Nixon, Nixon's fall from power, and a realignment of the South going into the Republican Party, becoming more conservative, the Eastern Seaboard in New England going into the Democratic Party. I think in the midst of this realignment, which may be nearing its end right now, Ronald Reagan came along and was acceptable to so many so-called Reagan Democrats, blue-collar Democrats, who were quite conservative, but they could never quite swallow Richard Nixon. But they took to Reagan quite naturally. But the Republican Party was becoming a more inhospitable party for the liberals when Reagan came in, and I believe he accelerated the process. Aaron, you mentioned the 1976 campaign, which is extraordinarily important because everybody in the party wanted Reagan to drop out after President Ford defeated him in New Hampshire and Illinois, and they said, you're just wasting your time. And he stayed in, and he won the North Carolina primary. If he had not stayed in and won North Carolina, Texas, California, several other states, he would have been considered an absolute has-been and a failure. He never would have been nominated in 1980.
And just briefly here, and I hope this isn't inappropriate to throw in on this sort of day, but that campaign, the '76 campaign, created some bad feelings between former President Ford and Mr. Reagan.
Well, it did, and of course we don't want to get into, we don't have the time for the detail, but there was almost a terrible thing that happened at the convention in Detroit where Ronald Reagan came to the very edge of signing off on a co-presidency to make Jerry Ford the vice president, where they would be co-presidents, really anti-constitutional, unconstitutional, and his better judgment prevailed. I think Ronald Reagan had very good judgment, and he really saw that this was not in the American way of things, and he stopped from making a terrible mistake and instead picked the senior George Bush as his vice president.
Well, I want all the detail on that story. I'll see you in Washington tomorrow. Mr. Novak, thank you, sir. Bob Novak with us tonight. We'll take a break. We have much more on an important night in American life as flags fly at half-staff. That's Simi Valley, California, where the Reagan Library is, and we'll visit that and much more as we continue on a special edition of Newsnight from New York.
For many years, HIV/AIDS has devastated individuals, communities, and even countries. But today, many people living with HIV and AIDS in developing countries are living longer, in part due to improvements in AIDS care and treatment. The Diflucan Partnership is at work in communities throughout the developing world to improve desperately needed medical treatment for those with HIV and AIDS. A network of private and public organizations, we are bringing donated medicine to those HIV sufferers who need them most. This includes an antifungal medicine, Diflucan, which is part of an effective treatment for many HIV patients. In addition, we provide training for healthcare providers, grant support, technical assistance, and innovative technology to help mobilize communities in the fight against AIDS. By combining effective medicine with community education and outreach, the Diflucan Partnership is making a difference.
This is CNN.
There is a place where words and pictures from around the globe come together to form a unique picture of our world. a place of unforgettable images and engaging stories. That place is CNN Traveler magazine, with stunning photographic news reviews, inspiring features, and exclusive contributions from CNN's unrivaled journalists. Subscribe to CNN Traveler, the magazine for people going places, at cnntraveler.com.
In his first TV interview...
You know, I've been asking questions all my life. A great interview is when the subject responds to the questions asked.
Oh my God, what a question. We saw the first world just collapse.
And when it comes out right, you know it, they know it, the audience really knows it. Ask the best questions you can, realizing what's going on.
Is it an emotional high for you?
It is.
To learn the most you can, bring it out and react to it. You do it.
Imagine a world where rivers run dry, where water is wasted and abused. That world is our world. Managing our world's water is a race against time. The IAEA, promoting the science of water for life.
This is CNN.
As with all presidents, Ronald Reagan has a presidential library. It is in the rolling hills just a bit north and a bit east of Los Angeles in the town of Simi Valley. It is also where he will finally be laid to rest by the end of next week sometime, we presume. CNN's Thelma Gutierrez is there for us tonight, and I suspect she is not alone. Good evening to you.
That is absolutely right, Aaron. I am not alone. In fact, many members of the media are here right now. Now, this library is also the largest presidential library. The flags here are flying at half staff, and the library was open all day today, just about till the moment that we heard news that the president had died. After that, it closed, but it certainly did not keep mourners away. It was a spontaneous moment, mourners listening to Amazing Grace through a car stereo. At the entrance to the library, dozens of people gathered throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Some were visibly moved and emotional as they placed cards, flags, and flowers, even a jar of jelly beans at the entrance to the Reagan Library. Now, this is a library that normally has 400 visitors a day. It houses 50 million pages of records and documents, which cover his days as governor of California from 1966 to 1970 and his 2 terms as president, as well as a piece of the Berlin Wall that is out here, and Air Force One, which flew the president more than 600,000 miles. Now, Aaron, one gift shop owner told me earlier today the phones were ringing off the hook. She says that people were just calling in and wanting to give their condolences. Aaron?
Thelma, thank you. It's a very sweet thing that people do in moments like this. They just want to be a part of the moment, and it's nice to see. Thank you for your work today. As a Hollywood actor, Ronald Reagan was a staunch union member. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He once said of his early political philosophy, "I was a near-hopeless hemophiliac liberal. I bled for causes. I had voted Democratic, following my father in every election. I was blindly and busily joining every organization I could find that would guarantee to save the world." He said that once. Later, he would come to believe that big government was the real evil from which people needed saving. Regardless of his political affiliation, Mr. Reagan's ability to make people feel he was on their side won him much admiration.
This is a very sad day for our country. Though Ronald Reagan has been ill for a long time, the finality of all of this is going to hit the American people very hard. And Barbara and I mourn the loss of a great president, and for us, a great friend.
I think, despite what many people would say, that he had the fortitude to face down the Russian Empire, and was a believer in the American system. So that, I think, would be his legacy.
He was just a great guy and did a lot for this country.
he had a great personality, and I know he was very communicative, and he was very open, and he was great with people, and that's what counts.
He connected with people in a remarkable way. It was exceptional. I think that was so much a part of his leadership, his ability to communicate his belief and love for America, his vision for prosperity, his vision for a strong America in the world. And that really restored our self-confidence and inspired us, I think, all to greater things.
He presided over a period of great prosperity and stability, and probably the last bit of stability we have experienced in this country.
Ronald Reagan won America's respect with his greatness and won its love with his goodness. He had the confidence that comes with conviction, the strength that comes with character, the grace that comes with humility, and the humor that comes with wisdom. He leaves behind a nation he restored and a world he helped save.
I had such a profound respect for him, not only as a president, but as a person. He and Nancy, I think they were an example as a married couple. You know, their love and support and the mutual respect they had for one another was an inspiration to all of us.
Man loved people, and he had this great strength of conviction. And as a result of that, he was able to change America and the world in the direction of his convictions, rather than being one of these politicians who, you know, reads public opinion polls and shifts and changes. And Ronald Reagan was Ronald Reagan. And he knew what he believed, and he was able to change the world as a result of that.
Rudy Giuliani on Ronald Reagan, the former mayor, was out at the track today hoping to see a Triple Crown. That didn't happen. When we come back, Jeff Greenfield on the humor of the 40th president. That's Santa Monica, California, tonight out by the ocean in Southern California. Flags and flowers and notes there remembering the president and his family on this sad day. We'll be right back.
Olympic Update 2004 is sponsored by Samsung, worldwide partner of the Olympic Games. Share the experience with Samsung.
Great Britain's rowers have enjoyed unparalleled Olympic success in recent years. In Sydney 2000, Sir Stephen Redgrave became the first athlete in history to win 5 gold medals. His teammate Matthew Pinsent won his 3rd that day and is poised for yet more glory in Athens this summer.
We've got quite a busy European racing schedule ahead of the Olympics, obviously, in August. So, you know, it's all gearing up now. It's getting exciting.
Joining Pinsent in Britain's boat will be James Cracknell, who also won gold in Sydney. The lineup is completed by Steve Williams and Alex Partridge, who helped Britain to World Cup success in May. And with 4 gold medals already between them, Britain's coxless 4 have the experience and the pedigree to row themselves to victory in Athens.
This year it has no boundaries. Samsung is proud to sponsor the first global torch relay to the Athens 2004 Olympic Games. Share the experience. Learn more at samsung.com.
Someone said that President Dwight Eisenhower's true political philosophy was his smile. President Reagan's philosophy, on the other hand, was very well defined, whether you liked it or not. But with political friend and foe alike, that smile didn't hurt either. Here again, Jeff Greenfield.
I had a phone call the other night.
1980, the Al Smith dinner in New York. Ronald Reagan's age is an issue that overhangs the presidential campaign. President Carter, Reagan says, called him with a question.
Ronna, I called her, said, how come you look younger every day when I see a new picture of you riding horseback? And I said, well, Jimmy, that's easy. I just keep riding older horses.
So much for the age issue. But in 1984, Reagan stumbles badly in his first debate with Walter Mondale.
But I also believe something else about that. I believe that, and when I became governor of California, I started...
And whispers about his age are getting louder. Then in the second debate, Reagan says,
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
So much for the age issue. 2 years later, President Reagan confronts another issue. Is he lazy?
I don't know about you, but I've been working long hours. I've really been burning the midday oil.
All through his public life, Reagan demonstrated as skillful a use of humor as any political figure. Reporter Lou Cannon, who chronicled Reagan throughout his political career, says it was far more than simply a pleasant personality trait.
I think Reagan's humor was the key to his political success.
I'm so desperate for attention, I almost considered holding a news conference.
Reagan knew if you make fun of yourself, that you establish a bond with people. He did it all the time.
He knew, by instinct or by experience, that if you joke about a presumed weak spot, people relax about it. If it doesn't bother me, the joke says, it shouldn't bother you.
Preparing me for a press conference was like reinventing the wheel. It's not true. I was around when the wheel was invented, and it was easier.
Thus, Reagan's acceptance speech at the 1980 Republican Convention began by noting his first career.
Well, the first thrill tonight was to find myself for the first time in a long time in a movie on prime time.
But Reagan's humor was also a tool he used to defang opponents, some of whom saw Reagan as a dangerous extremist. Longtime Reagan aide Mike Deaver.
In some instances, probably that's what people had thought before they came into the room if they'd believed everything they'd read about him. So he did use humor to sort of soften his own image.
And longtime political adversaries, like former Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, agree.
He had kind of this little lilt, this little twinkle that worked when he was dealing with people. So that folks could come in very angry about something, but they would kind of melt down. I wish he had more substance. He couldn't have had more grace. And humor is a wonderful way to have grace and take the edge off life, which a lot of people need to do today.
His humor was a gift on display at the most serious of moments. When he was shot in 1981, he was quoted as saying to the doctors, quote, "I hope you're all Republicans."
That was the beginning of the real change in people's perceptions about Reagan.
That, says Michael Deaver, was grace under fire.
I heard those speakers at that other convention saying, we won the Cold War. And I couldn't help wondering just who exactly do they mean by we?
And his humor was there in one of his last public appearances, at the 1992 Republican Convention, where he mocked both Bill Clinton and himself.
This fellow they've nominated claims he's the new Thomas Jefferson. Well, let me tell you something. I knew Thomas Jefferson.
In politics, humor is like nitroglycerin, powerful but dangerous. In the wrong hands, attempts at humor have ended political careers. In the hands of a master like Ronald Reagan, there is no better tool. Jeff Greenfield, CNN.
We're at the Gaslowly Neurological Center, where important progress is being made in our understanding of human cognition. Here we see a researcher testing the prefrontal cortex of 4-year-old Caitlin. The prefrontal cortex, located here, is primarily responsible for reasoning and decision-making.
How about this circle?
Given a set of simple images, Caitlin is first asked to sort by shape.
Perfect. Now I'm going to ask you to match up the colors, okay?
But when the rules are changed, something very interesting happens. Caitlin follows the previous instructions.
What about this one?
This is because of something called attentional inertia, where the brain makes certain assumptions based on previously learned patterns. This kind of ingrained thinking can be very difficult to alter once established. Here we see an adult subject, Matt.
How are you? Good.
He's being shown images of luxury cars, and he's asked to identify them.
That is a Mercedes. Alexis. Oh, BMW.
But now the researcher shows him the same pictures with one small difference.
That's a Mercedes. Alexis. BMW.
Soon, Volkswagen will introduce a new kind of luxury car, the Phaeton, which gives you a little time, at least, to totally rewire your brain.
I want to go to Tokyo. Chill out in Zen Central. I want to have so much spending money. I can tip people left, right, and center. I want to speak fluent Japanese. So when people say, konnichiwa, I say, wa, watashi wa nihongo haneshimasu. And they'd say, wa, kare wa nihongo haneshimasu. Maybe I'll try a kendo fight too. Man to man, one-on-one. Kendo? Can do.
Log on now and win yourself a dream getaway.
I used to have great legs until one human error took one of them away. 90% of all car crashes worldwide are caused by human error. Drive and walk safely. You'll protect yourself and those around you. Road safety is no accident.
For years, Jean Kirkpatrick was one of Ronald Reagan's most fervent supporters. She ultimately served him as the American ambassador to the United Nations, but she was much, much more than that. We're happy to say that Ambassador Kirkpatrick is joining us tonight. It's nice to see you. The president had not a simplistic, but in some respects a very simple view that if we could spread free markets, we could spread freedom and prosperity. Fair enough?
I think that's fair, right?
And it was almost a religion to him.
Well, he believed that free markets were very important.
How did that play out in his foreign policy? It's one thing to believe it, it's another thing to try and sell it.
Well, I had the experience at the United Nations early on of being confronted with the need, the instructions really, to present the United States principal speech at something called the ECOSOC conference, that's Economic and Social Council, at which he was meeting leaders of the world leaders, the whole to discuss the question of development. Mm-hmm. The issue was how can the developed countries most effectively help the least developed countries to make their way to greater affluence. And he understood the problem, and the problem was that the most developed countries had, he felt, all been taken the free market road to development, but nobody knew it. And he wanted very much, early in his presidency, to explain at every opportunity, and have members of his cabinet explain at every opportunity, how the free market road to development got countries to development, and how that is, you know, that rather than north-south schemes is what the world ought to be paying attention to at that stage.
A couple other areas, if I may. How did he see a difference between the Russians and the Chinese? Did he feel that one was a more solvable problem, if you will, than the other?
I don't think I know the answer to that. I had many conversations with President Reagan about the Soviet Union, frankly, and not just about the Russians, about the Soviet Union. He thought of them as Soviet communists, rather than Russians, you know. And he was very much aware of the spread of Soviet communism in the world. and China was one piece of that. But I did not have a sense that he conceived China as an independent problem.
Madam Ambassador, it's nice to talk to you tonight. Thank you. This is an important night, and your words are helpful in understanding the man who passed away today. Thank you. We're joined now from San Francisco by Kieran Skinner, one of the editors of what truly is one of the more fascinating political books, if that's the right way to put it, Reagan in His Own Hand, which examined several hundred radio commentaries Mr. Reagan wrote out in longhand and delivered between 75 and 79. Ms. Skinner is also a professor of history and political science at Carnegie Mellon University, and so we're glad to see her with us tonight. Welcome. Do you see, when you look at his writing in that period of his life, before he becomes president, but when he is very active politically, is there an evolution, or is it in stone?
I think there's a political evolution between 75 and 79. When he steps down as governor of California in early 75, January, he immediately begins a radio broadcast that is on more than 300 radio stations, a newspaper column. He gives about 10 speeches a month. And you see his ideas and his themes becoming increasingly more sophisticated over time. His understanding of the Cold War, of the Soviet Union, of U.S. grand strategy, of the economic challenges, he becomes increasingly more sophisticated and thoughtful and elegantly reductionist over those years.
Help me understand the last sentence.
You said in your conversation with Ambassador Kirkpatrick that Reagan had a couple of simple ideas. I think that about the Cold War, about markets and so forth, I think Reagan did have some quote-unquote simple ideas, but they were derived from hard work and study. And what our books, my co-edited books with Martin and Annalise Anderson of Stanford show, Reagan was working out in great detail, reading and writing, to come up with the very quote-unquote simple hypotheses that guided him. He had 4 about the Cold War, and they seemed like heresy at the time. And they might have seemed simple, but in detail they were very hard, and he actually used those words quite often. He said first, the Soviet Union, he felt, was so weak at bottom. He was saying this in the 70s now, at the height of détente, when we thought that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were kind of coming together in a way, and that there had to be a recognition as the Soviet Union as more of a normal state in the international system. He said, no, the Soviet Union is so weak at bottom, its economy, that it can't sustain a technology race with us and recover. Second, he argued, and many Sovietologists disagreed straight through his presidency until the Soviet Union fell apart. He said the sole source of legitimacy of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe was the Red Army of occupation. Pull the Red Army out, the countries would go their own way. We know that happened after 1989. Third, he argued that the American economy was so strong at bottom that it could sustain maybe some deficits, definitely a technology race, and recover. And finally, and this seemed very much like heresy shortly after Vietnam, but he was making this case, that the American public would support something like peacetime rearmament if American leaders would only explain that that was a strategy to get to a very different goal, which was mutual cooperation with our adversary, the Soviet Union. So he seemed like he had these... I'll stop there.
I'm sorry. I felt like I was a student in the class there for a minute. Let me throw in... Let me ask one more question. In sort of researching him, reading him over time, does he ever express regrets for positions he took? We're all a product of our times, but he was vehement in his opposition to Medicare, for example, in the 60s. He was not a supporter of the '64 Civil Rights Act, for example. Do we ever see in him an evolution of his social thinking in that regard?
I think that's an excellent question, Aaron. We do see that in Ronald Reagan, and I think one of the best examples, you're right, he didn't support the '64 civil rights legislation. And a good example of I think, an evolution in Reagan's thinking, and sometimes a quick updating, was the fact that he signed the Martin Luther King holiday after earlier having wondered aloud in a press conference if Martin Luther King had been associated with communists. He signed the bill starting the holiday and also called Mrs. King to apologize. So we do see Reagan being very adept at changing and adapting to times and updating his own philosophy.
Good to have you with us today. Will you come back this week?
I sure will.
Thank you much.
Bye.
Thank you. We'll take a break here. We're going to take a look at some of the morning papers, other things to do in our last 10 minutes or so with you tonight. This is a special edition of Newsnight.
My mommy says that one day everyone will have a home. A healthy, safe place to live. A home that can be proud to call their own. A home that they helped build. We just need to help ourselves and each other to get rid of poverty housing all over the world.
Since 1976, Habitat for Humanity has worked with families in need to build more than 150,000 simple, decent, low-cost homes in over 80 countries. Habitat for Humanity, turning hope into homes.
Imagine a world where rivers run dry, where water is wasted and abused. That world is our world. Managing our world's water is a race against time. The IAEA, promoting the science of water for life.
Excuse me, ma'am. Would you like to have my seat?
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
Just a few morning papers from around the country. Headlines are interesting, but the pictures they chose are, I think, the most notable on a day like today. This is how the Boston Herald will arrive on the doorsteps. The good folks in Boston tomorrow. Ronald Reagan, 1911-2004, American legend. And that's the picture they chose, and that's a good one. The Richmond Times-Dispatch does a drawing. But this is a drawing you're going to see a lot of, or a picture you'll see a lot of. The Great Communicator is the headline, and the lead reads, Ronald Wilson Reagan, a president who reshaped the politics of his own country and the balance of global power, died yesterday at his home in California. He was 93, the longest living president. Quickly, here both, I can show them both to you. Newsweek, recognize that picture? You don't get Newsweek, you get Time? Well, we're pleased around here to hear that, by the way. Actually, we love them both. Same picture. And a commemorative edition in both. And these guys were scrambling today, believe me. They go to bed on Saturdays. They had to redo the magazines. Charlotte Observer, farewell, Mr. President. That's a nice shot, too. The Cincinnati Enquirer, nation mourns loss of Reagan. And we always end this with the Chicago Sun-Times, and we will again tonight. This is the picture. And this is, to me, the picture of Ronald Reagan, cowboy hat and all. We'll wrap up the night in just a moment.
Tens of thousands of civilians fled their homes during the fight.
Struck a police checkpoint outside UN.
People on both sides of the disputed line of control were hoping for peace. Complex world security issues and challenges demand forward-looking, innovative approaches that lead to sustainable peace and good governance. The United Nations University is working to understand and offer solutions to the small and great issues of peace and conflict. United Nations University, working today for a better tomorrow.
Global challenges, highlighting technologies, helping people. This week, changes in the wind. Germany banks on renewable sources of energy for the future. The chocolate alternative. A sweet harvest empowers the locals while preserving the Amazon. And going green in the big city. A London community takes advantage of nature's resources to offer a fossil-free lifestyle. These are the global challenges. Tonight, only on CNN.
This is CNN.
At the end of Ronald Reagan's second term, some of the luster had left the administration and some of the gleam had gone out of his eye. He remained, however, the consummate communicator. On January 11th, 1989, after 8 years in office, he spoke to Americans for one last time from the Oval Office.
My fellow Americans, this is the 34th time I'll speak to you from the Oval Office, and the last. We've been together 8 years now, and soon it'll be time for me to go. But before I do, I wanted to share some thoughts, some of which I've been saving for a long time. It's been the honor of my life to be your president. So many of you have written the past few weeks to say thanks, but I could say as much to you. Nancy and I are grateful for the opportunity you gave us to serve. One of the things about the presidency is that you're always somewhat apart. You spend a lot of time going by too fast in a car someone else is driving, and seeing the people through tinted glass, the parents holding up a child, and the wave you saw too late and couldn't return. And so many times I wanted to stop and reach out from behind the glass and connect. Well, maybe I can do a little of that tonight. People ask how I feel about leaving, and the fact is, parting is such sweet sorrow. The sweet part is California and the ranch and freedom. The sorrow, the goodbyes, of course, and leaving this beautiful place. I want a nickname, the Great Communicator. But I never thought it was my style or the words I used that made a difference. It was the content. I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full bloom from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation, from our experience, our wisdom, and our belief in the principles that have guided us for 2 centuries. They called it the Reagan Revolution. Well, I'll accept that. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. Common sense told us that when you put a big tax on something, the people will produce less of it. So we cut the people's tax rates, and the people produced more than ever before. I've been asked if I have any regrets. Well, I do. The deficit is one. I've been talking a great deal about that lately, but tonight isn't for arguments, and I'm going to hold my tongue. But in observation, I've had my share of victories in the Congress, but what few people noticed is that I never won anything you didn't win for me. They never saw my troops. They never saw Reagan's regiments, the American people. You won every battle with every call you made and letter you wrote demanding action. Well, action is still needed. If we're to finish the job, Reagan's regiments will have to become the Bush brigades. Soon he'll be the chief, and he'll need you every bit as much as I did. We've done our part, and as I walk off into the city streets, a final word to the men and women of the Reagan Revolution, the men and women across America who for 8 years did the work that brought America back. My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time, we made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Unlike most countries, the United States embodies in its president both the head of state and political leadership. On days like this, it is a good thing to keep in mind that whether you agreed with President Reagan on the issues or not, the political side, he was the head of state, your state. And so we can mourn tonight, and we do, his passing, even as we are relieved for his family, which has struggled for 10 years. We'll see you tomorrow from Washington. Good night.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Mann at the CNN Center. The United States has lost its great communicator, the voice of the conservative revolution that swept America in the 1980s and set in motion events that would lead to the end of the Cold War. Welcome now to CNN's coverage, our continuing coverage, of the death of Ronald Reagan. A man who led the United States with sunny optimism, a Cold Warrior who challenged the Soviet Union into its ultimate collapse. Former U.S. President Ronald Reagan is dead after a 10-year battle with Alzheimer's disease. Mr. Reagan died at his home in California with his wife and children at his side. He was 93 years old. Ronald Reagan served 2 terms. He was the 40th President of the United States. His tenure was marked by a strong stand against communism, by the Iran-Contra affair, and by his unique Hollywood style of leadership. Charles Bierbauer was CNN's senior White House correspondent during the Reagan administration. He gives us some perspective.
America today is prouder and stronger and better.
It was morning in America, both in Ronald Reagan's political campaigns and in his mind's eye, even as he closed 8 years as one of the nation's most popular presidents.
Twilight, not in America. Here it's a sunrise every day. Fresh new opportunities, dreams to build.
Reagan acknowledged no other scenario. That wasn't his nature, not the Gipper. Reagan's popularity stemmed in part from making Americans feel better about themselves and their country. Reagan wrote a few precepts to that popularity. Big government was bad, high taxes were bad, and the Soviet Union, the communists, were really bad.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
So Reagan built up U.S. arsenals with billions for bombers and missiles, Star Wars, and challenged the Kremlin leader.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Berlin Wall did not come down on his watch, but it did come down. Reagan helped put a wedge in the crack. A fireside meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985 to take the chill off the Cold War. A near leap into uncharted waters of disarmament the next year in Reykjavik. A genuine step in that direction, with arms agreements in Washington in 1987.
The maxim is, doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
I like it.
And in Moscow in 1988, by then 2 wary foes had mellowed.
What we decided to do is talk to each other instead of about each other.
Gorbachev's humiliation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, would come later. Reagan's own humiliation had already begun. It was called Iran-Contra, a double play of double dealing. Arms for hostages in Iran, despite avowals never to do that.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
And the money from selling arms to Iran to fund the Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua, despite congressional prohibitions on doing that.
I did not know about the diversion of funds. Indeed, I didn't know there were excess funds.
Do you solemnly swear
But the acts carried out by Marine Colonel Oliver North and others in the Reagan White House became undeniable.
We sold arms to a nation officially designated by our government as a terrorist state. This secret policy of selling arms to Iran damaged U.S. credibility. A great power cannot base its policy on an untruth without a loss of credibility.
Please state your full name by your last name for the record.
Ronald Reagan.
Years after leaving office, Reagan still had trouble acknowledging his administration had traded arms for hostages. He was as facile at dismissing fact as fiction as he was at elevating fiction to fact.
Well,
Dutch Reagan had, after all, come from Hollywood along an improbable road. As president, he often retraced that path and its intertwining fact and fiction, back to Dixon, Illinois, an itinerant and alcoholic father and God-fearing mother, and a youth in the Depression years. At Eureka College, a so-so football player, but a Notre Dame star in the movies.
Win just one for the Kipper.
In radio, where imagination counted in the days when he recreated ball games, and later, when images of countdowns had earth-shaking consequence.
All right, my fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
In the Cold War, no joking matter, though that's what Reagan was doing in front of an open microphone as he prepared for a radio address from his California ranch one Saturday morning.
Please, you don't stand up on me, do you?
Rancho del Cielo lived up to its name for Reagan, heaven. He could escape the trappings of the presidency there, except for the television cameras on a distant mountain. Reagan knew instinctively how to find a camera. He once told network reporters he was tempted during one of his ranch rides to clutch his chest and slump over in the saddle just to see what they'd report that night on the evening news.
We interrupt. There's been a late development.
Shots rang out as President Reagan left the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon shortly after.
Reagan had, of course, been shot, barely 2 months after taking office, by John Hinckley, an attention-seeking young man, committed ever since to a mental institution. As Reagan was about to undergo surgery, he said he hoped his doctors were all Republicans. Not that Reagan himself had always been one. It was not, he said, that he had left the Democratic Party, but that the Democratic Party had left him. Ronald Reagan came to the attention of conservative Republicans in 1964, defending Barry Goldwater and assailing the Democrats.
They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right.
Goldwater lost, but Reagan, whose Hollywood star was setting, was launched into politics. There were 2 terms as governor of California.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
And 2 as the 40th and oldest president of the United States. In 1980, Reagan defeated an embattled incumbent, Jimmy Carter. In 1984, a landslide re-election over Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale.
I think that's just been arranged.
Reagan won the vote of Reagan Democrats, then flexed his political muscle. Firing the nation's striking air traffic controllers, winning few friends with labor. Staunchly opposing abortion, winning few friends among feminists. But he also made Sandra Day O'Connor the first woman justice on the Supreme Court. Reagan ordered the capture of Grenada from a ragtag Cuban force and the bombing of Libya to retaliate against terrorism.
1,053 pages report weighing 14 pounds.
Still, the Reagan presidency had its debits. His trickle-down economy led to a piling up of the national debt on his watch. There were head-on clashes with Congress.
Congress shouldn't send another one of these.
And tragedies. 241 Marine lives lost in Beirut. 269 deaths when Soviet fighters shot down a Korean airliner. 270 in a terrorist strike on Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland. The shattering of dreams on the Space Shuttle Challenger. And while Reagan was sworn in on the day American hostages came home from Iran, he left office with Americans still hostage in Lebanon. He also left the office changed in the way it did business, creating the well-staged presidency. Pont-du-Hoc, Normandy, where U.S. soldiers 40 years earlier came ashore on D-Day. The canvas, the lighting, and the actor's touch that could command a tear in any eye.
These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war.
Could also summon a laugh. A political favorite was about a young boy trying to sell a litter of what he called Republican puppies.
And a newspaper reporter who was nearby and had been present the week before said, "Hey, kid, wait a minute. Last week you said those were Democrat pups. Now you're saying the Republicans." And the kid says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, how come?" He said, "That's easy." He says, "This week they got their eyes open."
Ronald Reagan had no more partisan supporter than Nancy Reagan, his second wife. He was the nation's first divorced president. But his was an often troubled family. By Reagan and his first wife, actress Jane Wyman, a daughter, Maureen, who hovered in her father's political circles, and an adopted son, Michael, who complained about being cut off from his father. By Nancy, a favored son, Ron, and a renegade daughter, Patty Davis, whose scarcely disguised novels exposed family wounds. But it was always Nancy at the president's side with a whisper of help.
Doing everything we can. Doing everything we can.
And doing everything she could to enhance his image. Until it was time for Reagan to move on, turning over the reins to George Bush. Nearing his 80s, Reagan went into a largely quiet retirement. In 1994, Reagan's still faithful acolytes and allies brought him back for the memories.
You strode into our midst at a time when America needed you most. This great country had been through a period of national malaise, bereft of any sense of moral direction. Through it all, throughout 8 of the fastest moving years in memory, you were unflappable and unyielding.
It was what Reagan called the 44th anniversary of his 39th birthday. Later that year, Reagan, in a handwritten letter, informed the nation he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a mentally debilitating affliction of the elderly. The Reagans in the White House had guarded information about his colon and skin cancers, but the former president went public about Alzheimer's, hoping to raise public awareness of the disease. Earlier, Reagan's memory was, at times, a joking matter, but his deterioration was apparent, and the Reagan faithful at the 83rd birthday felt it would be their last chance to honor the Gipper, whose run had its stumbles, as well as its all-American heroics. Reagan was, he once wrote, a sucker for heroes, and as his 1984 campaign song proclaimed, proud to be an American.
If tomorrow all the things were gone I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away.
Charles Bierbauer, CNN, Washington.
A man who captured the heart of America, Ronald Reagan, dead at age 93. Next week, the late president's remains are to lie in state in Washington, but just a few hours ago, his body was brought in a flag-draped coffin to a funeral home in Santa Monica. Ted Rowlands joins us from there now. Ted?
And that is where the president's remains are this evening. There is a crowd of people here that has been here throughout the day here in Santa Monica after word first traveled that the president had passed away, and then that they were moving the remains from his home in Bel Air, where he passed away about 1 o'clock Pacific time here in California. He was brought to Santa Monica. It is expected, according to folks from the Reagan staff, that he will remain here throughout the weekend, and then at the family's direction, the chain of events will begin. Starting in California, it is expected that the president's remains will first go to Simi Valley and the Presidential Library, then on to Washington, where he will lie in state in the rotunda of the Congress, and then the funeral will take place at the National Cemetery in Washington. People have come out here, they say, for many different reasons. All of them seem to say they just want to be here in this moment of time and to pay their respects.
And got to know him as a person and admired someone who could change careers and grow to the highest level.
I think his wit was terrific. I think some of his one-liners and some of the things he said, the classic when he was shot in pain in the hospital and he asks if all the doctors are Republicans. I mean, that kind of quick wit, I loved it. He was terrific.
A short news conference has been scheduled for tomorrow at noon Pacific time to outline the specific plans as directed by the family. That, of course, will be the beginning of this process of laying President Ronald Reagan to rest. He will eventually be laid to rest in California at his ranch in Simi Valley.
Ted Rowlands, thanks very much. Ronald Reagan will be remembered as much for the kind of man he was as for the things that he did. Frank Sesno watched many of the late president's actions in office and after office. His film, A Legacy Remembered, chronicles the Reagan's years. And Frank Sesno joins us now. Your thoughts about this man and his times?
Much more complex than we realized at the time, much more complex than his adversaries gave him credit for. Came into office striking a very tough line, in the view of some, a rather simplistic, even warmongering line. It drew a lot of criticism in Europe. Left office having accomplished remarkable things, to include the foundation that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the end, Ronald Reagan reached across the Atlantic and grasped Mikhail Gorbachev's hands, and they established a very firm partnership built on a personal relationship that allowed Gorbachev to make the reforms that he made inside the Soviet Union that ended the Cold War. It really was an astounding journey, and one that confounded his critics every step of the way. Reagan's presidency was a scripted presidency. But you know what? He wrote most of that script, and it wasn't appreciated fully at the time by those who derided him as a simplistic cowboy, former actor from the West Coast.
In fact, even some of his closest colleagues said that he couldn't separate fact and fiction very easily. There were egregious stories that he would tell of things that never happened, that in fact were episodes from his film career. But the U.S. public forgave him that. He had some kind of special link to the American psyche. What was it?
Oh, you know, it's such a complicated question. There was a genuineness to him about him, I think. There was a tremendously present self-deprecating humor, and that goes a long way. He wasn't a mean man, and where he and Margaret Thatcher, for example, shared ideology in terms of reducing the size of government, getting people off the dole, diminishing the role of unions. It was, after all, Reagan who fired the air traffic controllers on practically his first day on the job. Nonetheless, Reagan had a soft personal side. And you know, what people didn't realize is throughout his presidency, he was writing letters to people. He wrote 8,000 to 10,000 letters during his presidency. He made personal donations to people. That was the private side of Reagan, and it demonstrated itself almost subliminally. And I think that's how the American public picked up on it. His numbers went down, his poll approval numbers went way down in 1982 when unemployment in America hit 10%. But they then rebounded, and it was mourning in America. They went down again after Iran-Contra in the latter part of his presidency, but again the numbers went up, and he left office a very popular president.
Now, Margaret Thatcher clearly saw something in him. What about other world leaders? You traveled with the president on his travels, meeting with others, Western allies, and even in the Soviet Union. What impact did he have on them?
Well, he impressed them, but he also confused them. One of my favorite stories is one that was told to me by the former Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who was actually quite close to President Reagan. And he told me of a meeting that he had with the late French President, François Mitterrand, who really didn't care for Reagan that much and was rather critical of him, saw him as something of a simpleton and not living up to the complex culture that the President of France felt that his country represented. But according to Mulroney, Mitterrand said to him at one point, he says, you know, Ronald Reagan has a communion with the American people. That is to say, he connects with the American people, which is something that's very rare, very special, and that Mitterrand recognized that he didn't have with his French public.
Let me ask you about Alzheimer's, which took away the last 10 years of Ronald Reagan's life. There are some questions that some of the odd and quirky little aspects of his personality in the Oval Office may in fact have been colored by the onset of Alzheimer's. You were there at the time. What sense did people around him have of the progression or even the arrival of that disease?
Well, a couple things. This is very interesting. I was covering Reagan in the White House in 1982. I had an editor in 1982 who said, you know, I think this guy Reagan's got Alzheimer's. Go prove it. Well, you know, you're not going to prove it, and you couldn't prove it. But there was a quality to him that was a little bumbling, very genuine, but sometimes a little bit inaccurate or imprecise, and people perceive that to be some kind of impairment. Not the case at all. Fact of the matter is that to those close to Reagan, they started seeing in the early 90s, really, I'm sorry, more like 93 or so, they started seeing some evidence of real decline. Michael Deaver talks, he was one of Reagan's top aides and confidants, of going to see him in that period of time in the early 90s with a dignitary, a foreign, I believe it was a foreign visitor, and went in and said, Mr. President, tell so-and-so this joke that Reagan would tell all the time. And Reagan looked at Deaver and said, what joke, Mike? Another time he was with Merv Griffin, the actor and a very close friend of the Reagans, at Griffin's Ranch. Merv Griffin tells this story. This occurred in 1994. And Merv Griffin said to the president, come on, Mr. President, let's go down and look at the horses. And the president always went to horses. He was an avid horseback rider. And Griffin says the president looked up to him and said, no, I just don't want to go. I just want to sit here. So there was a sense then that something was wrong, and shortly after that, in November of '94, came the letter. It was a time of great difficulty for the family. Mrs. Reagan was very slow in letting go. The last couple of years were very difficult for them because he was completely non-communicative, didn't recognize anybody, was not ambulatory, was really confined to bed pretty much all the time. I should tell you, though, that he was very strong, and in 2001, he broke his hip. They didn't expect him to last 6 months, and he lasted 3.5 years.
CNN's Frank Cisner, our former bureau chief, now a special contributor for this coverage. Thanks so much for this.
You bet.
We're going to back up a few years to the early years, in fact, of the first term of office that Ronald Reagan served. In 1982, he sent U.S. Marines into Lebanon to, in his words, restore order and stability to that troubled land. A year later, a suicide bombing on a Marine barracks in Beirut killed 241 U.S. servicemen. Our Beirut bureau chief, Brent Sadler, joins us now to talk about Ronald Reagan's intervention in Lebanon and his legacy in the Middle East. Brent?
Yes, John, these were very, very difficult times for U.S. policy in this part of the world. The PLO, Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization, has sought refuge after Black September in 1970 in Jordan. And really, the PLO set up a state within a state here. It had its own militia, controlled streets, and so on and so forth. And it was the beginning of the Israeli invasion that drove out the PLO from Beirut back in 1982, Operation Peace for Galilee, that saw the PLO being bottled up by the Israelis, the city of Beirut under a siege by the Israelis, and the Marines coming in here, several hundred of them, 800 of them coming in here to assist in the evacuation of the PLO. That happened. They were taken out from ships. And that led, not so much later, to a multinational peacekeeping force after the what's known here worldwide as the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, massacre of several hundred, some say even more, thousands of Palestinian refugees in 2 camps, which are still here just 10 minutes drive from the road from where I'm standing. And that brought in a multinational peacekeeping force led again by US Marines, 1,200 of them, assisted by British, French and Italian peacekeepers. And it was during that tour of duty that the 241 Marines were killed in an appalling attack on the Marine barracks just on the outskirts of the airport here. 241 Marines killed in a devastating strike. That was the greatest loss of life, compared to Vietnam, of any one single action in Vietnam. And it really polarized and changed America's role in trying to pacify this country that was in the throes of its civil war. There were many complaints, I was here, reported it extensively at the time, from American commanders that there were very limited rules of engagements, that the Americans effectively in their peacekeeping roles here, along with their European allies, were sitting targets. So very, very difficult times, and eventually the United States changed its policy and pulled out. And of that Marine barracks bombing, Jonathan, President Reagan did say that intervention was one of his greatest sorrows, given the heavy loss of life. John.
Was anyone ever made to pay for that attack? Was there ever any counterstrike by the United States? I ask that question because some critics point to that episode as an early and crucially missed opportunity to take on terrorists attacking the United States.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There was a lot of criticism. There was some retaliation, just really cursory retaliation against some Lebanese targets. But the Americans got stuck here in the Civil War. The leftist forces on the ground here, the warlords, the so-called militia commanders at the time, they're now in government, some of them. I know them well during the war, I know them well today. And they felt that America, you know, backed a pro-Israeli government. Israel was trying to prize Lebanon away from neighboring Syria in terms of a double power block. Striking a peace deal with Lebanon, with Israel at that time, would have been very helpful to US strategic policies in this part of the world at that time, and the Israelis. And the Americans were seen as coming on side at the behest of Reagan's policy here with the Israelis. And that really spurned a whole series, exploded really, if you like, the terrorism factor here within Lebanon. And there's resonance, say many observers here, to what's happening in Iraq today, that the Marine barracks bombing was a template, a blueprint for a spectacular, devastating suicide bomb attack against an American base. And the kind of terror tactics that were learned here were exported from here, and we're seeing some of them, if not many of them, being repeated. Let's not forget those hostage years. There were many, many extremist, violent groups here. The Americans were ensnared. Terry Anderson, you recall, the longest-held American hostage, the AP bureau chief here, as well as many other Americans and French and Germans and British taken as hostage here. And that, of course, led to the infamous Iran-Contra affair. John.
The history doesn't end, in fact. CNN's Brent Sadler in Beirut. Thanks very much. Coming up, a look back at Ronald Reagan's role in the fall of the Soviet bloc. We'll go to Moscow next. Stay with CNN.
He's smart, insightful, opinionated. Aaron Brown. For a unique take on each day's news, join Newsnight live from New York, only on CNN.
On the next World News Asia, India's place in the world. I'm Veronica Pedrosa. How the new left-of-centre government may tilt its policies with other countries. Watch World News Asia, only on CNN.
Stay in touch. Stay in the know. Stay in a CNN partner hotel. For a full listing of CNN partner hotels, visit cnn.com/travel.
We need to focus on the small details in order to appreciate the broad perspective. To help you understand our world better, Insight looks at its people and its issues. Political, economic, social, the details and the big picture they make up. Insight, for the story within the story, only on CNN.
Excuse me, ma'am. Would you like to have my seat?
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
This is CNN.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
One of Ronald Reagan's most frequently cited achievements was his role in helping bring down the wall. Many will remember him as a president who first railed against the Soviet Union and then forged a relationship with its leaders, helping to end the Cold War. Jill Doherty is CNN's Moscow bureau chief, and she joins us now from the Russian capital. Jill?
Well, Jonathan, you know, if you asked Russians about Ronald Reagan, even today, people who weren't even born at that time, a lot of the phrases that he used, the terminology of the Cold War came from Ronald Reagan. Just think, evil empire, ash heap of history. That phrase that we just heard, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. This really went into the lexicon of Russians, and they really think of him as the defining symbol of that Cold War relationship. Now, obviously, it's a different world right now, but that went into the mentality of Russians here.
Jill, not to take anything away from Ronald Reagan's achievement, but was his timing lucky? There were a string of deaths in the Kremlin. The Soviet economy had been collapsing for decades. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived on the scene. Ronald Reagan contributed enormously to what the U.S. could bring to Soviet affairs, but is he the man who's responsible for what happened behind the Iron Curtain?
That's really the debate that still rages today and probably will for many years in the future. What did Mr. Reagan do? Did he actually, because of the military buildup that he had, did he actually push the Soviet Union to collapse? And many people would say, yes, that by increasing, in fact, the biggest defense buildup really in history, $1 trillion, and the idea of Star Wars, putting a missile defense system over the United States. By all of those things that he did help to bring about the end of the helped to bring about the end of the Soviet Union. Others would point to other factors. Some people would say the economy in the Soviet Union, although on the surface things look pretty good, was really unsustainable. It was too heavy, it was too cumbersome, it was not going to work, and it was doomed from the start. And then there are other more modern theories pointing out that back at that point you had crumbling oil prices, and Russia, a huge producer of oil. And that affected the economy as well. Then you had the internal rot, and that is where the human rights people would come in, and the people who felt that the ideology also was unsustainable. So there were many, many factors, but you'd have to say that Ronald Reagan and his push to fight the ideology of communism and ultimately to bury it, as he put it, on the ash heap of history, really was one of the key issues and factors.
Our Moscow bureau chief, Jill Doherty, thanks very much. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was a close personal friend and political ally of Reagan's. The two conservative leaders dominated the international scene in the 80s. Thatcher once called Reagan, quote, the second most important man in her life. Our European political editor, Robin Oakley, joins us now with more. Robin?
Well, John, Margaret Thatcher has said on Ronald Reagan's death that he was her closest political friend and one of her dearest personal friends. And there was a tremendous personal chemistry between the two of them. She used to go to see Reagan in the United States really to recharge her ideological batteries. They got on well. They were instinctive allies. She said when she first met him, she wrote in her memoirs that when she first met him as governor of California, she felt instinctively that he was somebody who felt and thought as she did. And of course, she developed Thatcherism in Britain. He had the tag Reaganomics attached to what he did. They were both driving, in a sense, for smaller government, lower taxes, a strong military, facing up to the trades unions, what he did with the air traffic controllers, and so on. There was a tremendous affinity there, and I think the two of them fed off each other and reassured each other in a way that, as you say, made them dominant political figures in the 1980s. He was, after all, president for 8 of the 11 years that she was prime minister in Britain, John.
She clearly will mourn Ronald Reagan. Will the British people mourn Ronald Reagan? Will he be mourned in Europe, for that matter?
Perhaps with some of what has come after him, there will be rather more mourning. I think a lot of European leaders, as Jill Doherty was saying earlier, people were worried initially about Ronald Reagan's Cold War rhetoric. But then they looked at what he did in practice and the relationship that he established with Mr. Gorbachev, and they realized that this was a man who, in the estimation of Europeans, grew in office and developed in office and showed himself open to wider influences than appeared possible when he first came to office. And many of them, I think, were hugely swept along by Ronald Reagan's personal charm. People who met him when he came to Europe used to say, well, here was a man without side, without affectation, didn't expect all the sort of panoply and over-fussy attention that some world leaders seem to expect. He was a genuinely nice guy with a sense of humor, with a genuine personal warmth. That communicated itself, and it helped to tone down some of the strength of what he was saying in political terms, John.
I'm intrigued because comparing the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, one has to think about the relationship now between George Bush and Tony Blair. Did it cost Margaret Thatcher votes that she was so fond of Ronald Reagan? Were there other comparisons that come to mind?
No, it was different at that time, really, in that Britain was very much going along with Thatcherism, certainly in the early stages of her life as Prime Minister. People felt they needed the kind of strong leadership that she was offering. And there again is that sort of parallel with Ronald Reagan, that she was seen to have all the black and white certainties of a tabloid news editor. And there was Ronald Reagan as the great communicator with an equal certainty. She was saying that he wasn't plagued by the kind of doubts that so many other politicians were. Now, at the time that she was in her prime, I think the British public were happy to go along with a lot of Thatcherism and what it had in common with Reaganism, particularly things like standing up to the trades unions, cutting taxes, and so on. And so, although there was some worry about his Star Wars program destabilizing the delicate balance of deterrence and so on, there was not the same degree of unpopularity attached to her links with Ronald Reagan that Tony Blair has had in dealing with George Bush. But of course, there's the difference, too, that Tony Blair is a Labour Prime Minister getting along with a Republican president, and one who is engaged in a very controversial war, John.
And there was a different war in those days, and Margaret Thatcher decided to begin that. We could talk about that another time. Robin Oakley, thanks very much. The current and former President Bush comment on the passing of Ronald Reagan. We'll hear from them when we come back.
What kind of people will we be 40 years from today?
May we answer free people, worthy of freedom and firm in the conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a chosen few, but the universal right of all God's children. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set forth in 1948, and this is the affirming flame the United States has held high to a watching world. We champion freedom not only because it is practical and beneficial, but because it is morally right and just.
Olympic Update 2004 is sponsored by Samsung, worldwide partner of the Olympic Games. Share the experience with Samsung.
Great Britain's rowers have enjoyed unparalleled Olympic success in recent years. In Sydney 2000, Sir Stephen Redgrave became the first athlete in history to win 5 gold medals. His teammate Matthew Pinsent won his 3rd that day and is poised for yet more glory in Athens this summer.
We've got quite a busy European racing schedule ahead of the Olympics, obviously, in August. So, you know, it's all gearing up now. It's getting exciting.
Joining Pinsent in Britain's boat will be James Cracknell, who also won gold in Sydney. The lineup is completed by Steve Williams and Alex Partridge, who helped Britain to World Cup success in May. And with 4 gold medals already between them, Britain's coxless 4 have the experience and the pedigree to row themselves to victory in Athens.
This year it has no boundaries. Samsung is proud to sponsor the first global torch relay to the Athens 2004 Olympic Games. Share the experience. Learn more at samsung.com.
On the next World News Asia, India's place in the world. I'm Veronica Pedrosa. How the new left-of-centre government may tilt its policies with other countries. Watch World News Asia, only on CNN.
This is a sad hour in the life of America. A great American life has come to an end. I have just spoken to Nancy Reagan. On behalf of our whole nation, Laura and I offer to her and the Reagan family our prayers and our condolences. Ronald Reagan won America's respect with his greatness and won its love with his goodness. He had the confidence that comes with conviction, the strength that comes with character, the grace that comes with humility, and the humor that comes with wisdom. He leaves behind a nation he restored and a world he helped save. During the years of President Reagan, America laid to rest an era of division and self-doubt. And because of his leadership, the world laid to rest an era of fear and tyranny. Now, in laying our leader to rest, we say thank you. He always told us that for America, the best was yet to come. We comfort ourselves in the knowledge that this is true for him, too. His work is done, and now a shining city awaits him. May God bless Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, was vice president under Ronald Reagan for 8 years. Mr. Bush then succeeded him in the Oval Office. He describes Reagan as a man of great character and diplomacy.
People ask me, well, what was so special about President Reagan? And on a personal basis, it was his kindness, his decency, his sense of humor, unbelievable. And he had a wonderful way where you could disagree with him. He'd have leaders in Congress or foreign leaders that he'd disagree with, and yet he was never disagreeable about it himself. He was never mean-spirited.
Beyond the United States, the swift international reaction to Reagan's death spoke of his impact on the global scene. French President Jacques Chirac called Reagan a great statesman who, through the strength of his convictions and his commitment to democracy, will leave a deep mark in history. The Canadian Prime Minister said, during his tenure as president, President Reagan's leadership served to define an era of sweeping geopolitical change. In particular, he helped lay the foundations for the end of the Cold War and a period of much greater cooperation between the West and the nations of the former Soviet Union. A spokesman for Queen Elizabeth II said simply, "The Queen is saddened by the news." Reagan handily won the presidential election in 1980 over the incumbent, Jimmy Carter, by pledging less government and lower taxes. But his international policies may have had the greatest impact on history. To tell us more about that, Kyron Skinner joins us now from our San Francisco bureau. She is a scholar and author and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
It's easy to overlook it now, but let me ask you to look back. How radical a break with U.S. policy, how radical a break with the policy of containment and coexistence did Ronald Reagan effect in his years in the White House?
I think that's the defining question, and Reagan's contribution to that answer is just really profound for the 20th century in our current international system. Reagan made a radical break with containment and the version of it being practiced in the 1970s détente, where U.S.-Soviet relations were to be on a more normal footing. He broke with it radically. He said, no, we can't just contain and manage the Cold War. We have to transform the international system. And he believed that could happen in a way that no Cold War president did. And so Reagan believed that the Soviet Union could come to join, or some version of it, a community of free states. And he told the American public and the world that to make that happen, military spending had to increase, there had to be rearmament, but that was only a strategy. The goal was very different, and that was to increase the number of people in the world living under freedom. And no Cold War president, again, had quite that vision, or at least articulated it in the way that Ronald Reagan did.
Now, one of the things that people overlook is, despite that Cold War rhetoric and his desire to really up the ante with the Soviet Union, that he signed the first arms reduction treaty in U.S.-Soviet history. Is that a contradiction with the way he was trying to do policy, or was that its logical result?
I think it's the logical result, but again, I think the rhetoric was part on the strategic side of the equation, and that his goal was always to get to cooperation with the Soviet Union. And in fact, if we think back to 1983, it was a very difficult year in both the United States and in Europe. Reagan, first in March, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Then a few days later, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, what we now call missile defense, which detractors called Star Wars. But at the same time, Ronald Reagan was opening a private channel to the Soviets and beginning a dialogue to get some Soviet Pentecostals out of the Soviet Union, and quiet diplomacy began. By the end of the year, the U.S. had placed intermediate nuclear forces in Western Europe, despite the objections of many Europeans. And the Cold War began to improve U.S.-Soviet relations in 1984. Despite that tough year, Reagan was opening the door for the INF Treaty, the reduction treaty that you just mentioned, which was signed in December 1987.
Clear successes. Let me ask you about what may have been less clearly a success, which was the Reagan doctrine of fighting communist-backed insurgencies around the world. Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, eventually the policy that led to the arms for hostage, or the Nicaraguan Iran-Contra scandal.
Right.
These were not successes, and they turned much of Latin America into a battleground. In retrospect, was Ronald Reagan's policy less successful in the Americas than it was in Europe?
No, I think that's a complex question, and the Reagan doctrine itself was complex. I think what happened in the Americas, remember, by the end of the Reagan presidency, at the end of the 80s, we began to see an outbreak of democracy in some of the very countries, including in Central America, elections and so forth, that we never thought could take place. And so there was some success out of that turmoil in the 1980s. If you're talking about Angola, the U.S. brokered the Angola-Namibian agreement in December 1988 that helped the Soviets begin a passage out of southern Africa. And so I think the Reagan doctrine, what it did was to bring the Cold War on the ground. Reagan said, we're going to meet you after Vietnam, where we'd pulled back. He was saying, we're now prepared to meet you again on the ground. And I think it made Soviet calculations about continuing the Cold War a lot more tight. And so I think that there were some successes of the Reagan doctrine, in fact, in hastening the end of the Cold War.
Karen Skinner of the Hoover Institution, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks.
Well, as we just heard, Reagan was driven by an ideological hatred of communism and a suspicion of big government, but his was an ideology tempered by humor. He knew how to play to a crowd, and his logic was simple: make them smile, establish a connection. As Jeff Greenfield recalls, Reagan was a master of it.
I had a phone call the other night.
1980, the Al Smith dinner in New York. Ronald Reagan's age is an issue that overhangs the presidential campaign. President Carter, Reagan says, called him with a question.
Ronna, I called her, said, how come you look younger every day when I see a new picture of you riding horseback? And I said, well, Jimmy, that's easy. I just keep riding older horses.
So much for the age issue. But in 1984, Reagan stumbles badly in his first debate with Walter Mondale.
But I also believe something else about that. I believe that, and when I became governor of California, I started...
And whispers about his age are getting louder. Then, in the second debate, Reagan says,
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
So much for the age issue. 2 years later, President Reagan confronts another issue. Is he lazy?
I don't know about you, but I've been working long hours. I've really been burning the midday oil.
All through his public life, Reagan demonstrated as skillful a use of humor as any political figure. Reporter Lou Cannon, who chronicled Reagan throughout his political career, says it was far more than simply a pleasant personality trait.
I think Reagan's humor was the key to his political success.
I'm so desperate for attention, I almost considered holding a news conference.
Reagan knew if you make fun of yourself, that you establish a bond with people. He did it all the time.
He knew, by instinct or by experience, that if you joke about a presumed weak spot, people relax about it. If it doesn't bother me, the joke says, it shouldn't bother you.
Preparing me for a press conference was like reinventing the wheel. It's not true. I was around when the wheel was invented, and it was easier.
Thus, Reagan's acceptance speech at the 1980 Republican Convention began by noting his first career.
Well, the first thrill tonight was to find myself for the first time in a long time in a movie on prime time.
But Reagan's humor was also a tool he used to defang opponents, some of whom saw Reagan as a dangerous extremist. Longtime Reagan aide Mike Deaver.
In some instances, probably that's what people had thought before they came into the room, if they'd believed everything they'd read about him. So he did use humor to sort of soften his own image.
And longtime political adversaries, like former Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, agree.
He had kind of this little lilt, this little twinkle that worked when he was dealing with people. So that folks would come in very angry about something, but they would kind of melt down. I wish he had more substance. He couldn't have had more grace. And humor is a wonderful way to have grace and take the edge off life, which a lot of people need to do today.
His humor was a gift on display at the most serious of moments. When he was shot in 1981, he was quoted as saying to the doctors, quote, "I hope you're all Republicans."
That was the beginning of the real change in people's perceptions about Reagan.
That, says Michael Deaver, was grace under fire.
I heard those speakers at that other convention saying, "We won the Cold War." And I couldn't help wondering just who exactly do they mean by we?
And his humor was there in one of his last public appearances at the 1992 Republican Convention, where he mocked both Bill Clinton and himself.
This fellow they've nominated claims he's the new Thomas Jefferson. Well, let me tell you something. I knew Thomas Jefferson.
In politics, humor is like nitroglycerin, powerful but dangerous. In the wrong hands, attempts at humor have ended political careers. In the hands of a master like Ronald Reagan, there is no better tool. Jeff Greenfield, CNN.
To learn more about the life and times of Ronald Reagan and his death at age 93 and the memorial services that are to come in the days ahead, log on to our special report on our website at CNN.com. There you'll find in-depth features, audio, and video remembrances of the late president and much more, all at CNN.com.